A stranger came up my front steps in January with a letter in his coat, and when I had read it twice, I was not a wife, my daughter was not a bride, and my 3 children had no lawful name in the state of New York. The letter was 4 years older than my eldest child. It was in my husband's hand, on my husband's father's paper, and in it he called another woman his wife before God, and the date at the top of it was written by a man who was already 19 weeks married to me. That was the smallest lie in it, and it took me until March to find the big one. But it did not begin that way at all. It began, as these things do, with a very good year. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. I am always astonished at how far these stories travel. Now settle in, and let me take you back. In the winter of 1889, I was 39 years old, and I lived in the best house on Ridge Street in Corliss Falls, New York. And if you had asked anybody in Onondaga County to name the fortunate women of that town, they would have named me first and then stopped to think about the second. I will describe the house because the house matters. It was brick, 3 stories, with a mansard roof and a tower on the east corner that had no use in the world except to be a tower. And my husband's father built it in 1862 out of the first good money the railroad ever made. There was a stone carriage block at the curb with our name cut into it. There was stained glass in the stair landing, a green and amber thing of lilies that threw colored light down the steps at 4 PM in the winter. And my youngest used to stand in it and hold out her hands to catch the colors. There were 9 grates to be laid every morning of my life from October to April, and a cook and a girl for the upstairs and a man for the horses, and Verity Cobb, who had come into that house as a chambermaid in 1859 and had been the housekeeper since before I was married into it. My name is Cordelia Merriwether, and I was born Cordelia Vandeleur, and my father was a judge of the county court. That is the whole of the thing if you want it in one line. I have thought about it for a great many years, and it always comes back to that. My father was a judge, and a judge's name closes doors that money cannot even find. My husband was Hollis Merriwether, 47 that winter, president of the Corliss Falls Southern Railroad. It was not a great road. It was 61 miles of track running south out of town through Onondaga and Lisle counties to the coal connection, with a spur to the gypsum works and another to the salt, and it made money in a quiet, unspectacular way for 30 years. And its shares were held by about 40 families in that valley and 1 bank in Syracuse. Hollis had inherited it from his father in 1876, along with the house and the pew and the habit of being deferred to. I want to be fair to him, because to be unfair would let him off. Hollis Merriwether was not a cruel man, and he was not a stupid man. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming. That is, he wanted very badly to be liked by whoever was in the room, and would say a thing he did not mean rather than watch a face go cold. He remembered every man's children's names. He was generous with $1 and could not deny a subscription list. He was tall and going soft at the middle, and he had a laugh you could hear from the front hall. He was afraid of exactly 1 person on this earth, and so was everyone else in that house, and she lived on the 2nd floor in the south room with the bay window. Ora Merriwether was 71 that winter, my husband's mother. She had married the founder of the road when she was 17, and he was a contractor with 2 mules and a grading crew, and she had kept his books for 11 years in a shanty at the end of track. And when he died in 1876, he left her the house outright and 410 shares in her own name, which was more than any other single holder, including her son. She wore black wool and jet, winter and summer, and she took her breakfast in her room and came down at 11. And she had a way of listening to you, with her head very slightly tipped and her hands folded, that made you hear your own sentence coming out of your mouth and want to take it back. In 19 years, she had never once been unkind to me. I want that written down. She was courteous. She was correct. She praised the table. She remembered my birthday, and she called me daughter. And there was not one day in 19 years when I did not feel, walking into a room where she was, that I was being inspected against a standard I had never been shown. We had 3 children. Lorena was 18, and she was engaged. That is the second thing that matters, so let me set it down properly. She had been promised since October to Sherrod Thatcher's son Wyatt. Thatcher was the president of the Onondaga County Savings Bank and had come up from nothing and cared about family the way only such men care. And the wedding was set for the 2nd of December, 1889, in the Presbyterian Church, with a breakfast for 140 at the house. Lorena had my mother's hair and her father's easy way with people, and none of his weakness. She had been fitted 3 times for the dress by January. Ansel was 15 and had opinions about locomotives and no interest whatever in the counting house end of a railroad, which grieved his father. And Minta was 9. Minta was the one who stood in the colored light on the stairs. Now I must tell you about the winter itself, because the town was in a fever that year, and it had nothing to do with me until it had everything to do with me. The Corliss Falls and Southern was going to be sold. The big system. I will not name it, though every soul in this valley knew it, and its lawyers are still in business, had been buying up short lines all through central New York for 3 years. And in November, their men had come to look at our 61 miles, and the offer they made in December was a very great deal of money. It was to be a purchase of shares, and the price talked of was $92 a share against a book value of about $50, and there was to be a vote of the directors and then of the holders, and the date set for the directors was the 12th of November of that new year. For a family like ours, it meant one thing: Ora's 410 shares and Hollis's 360, and the odd hundreds held by every prosperous family in Corliss Falls were about to turn into cash. My husband spoke of nothing else all winter. He had a plan for a house in the city. He had a plan for Ansel to go abroad. He had, though I did not know it yet, a great many private reasons to want that sale to go through clean, and one of them knocked on my door on the 9th of January at 4 in the afternoon. I remember that it was thawing, that filthy January thaw we get, and the snow was going gray, and there was water running in the gutters and dripping off the porch roof. Verity Cobb came to the morning room and said there was a young man at the door who would not give his business and would not go away, and would not come in either, and had been standing on the steps a quarter of an hour. "Is he selling something?" "No, ma'am." "Then what does he look like?" and Verity Cobb, who had been in that house 30 years and had never in my hearing said one word about the family she served, stood there with her hands at her waist and said, "He looks like Mr. Hollis." I have gone back to that sentence 10,000 times. She could have said, "He looks respectable." She could have said, "He is a young man of about 24, in a good coat gone shiny at the cuffs." She said what she said, and she said it looking directly at me. And I understand now that Verity Cobb had been waiting 19 years for that afternoon, and had decided in the hallway in about 4 seconds which side of it she was going to be on. I went to the door myself. He was standing at the bottom of the steps with his hat off, in the wet, bareheaded, which no man does unless he has decided something about how the conversation is to go. He was, perhaps, 24. He was slighter than my husband and darker, and his coat was good but 4 years old, and his boots had been cleaned that morning and had gotten wet since. And he had my husband's chin. He had that particular squared-off chin with the crease under the lower lip that I had looked at across a table for 19 years, and that my son Ansel had also. And I saw it on a stranger's face, standing in the slush on Ridge Street, and something went through me, from my scalp to my knees, like cold water thrown. "Mrs. Merriwether?" "I am." "My name is Nelson Prue. I have come from Utica." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I want to say first that I have not come here for money, and I will not take any if it is offered. And if you send me away now, I will go and not come back." "Then what have you come for?" "To ask you a question," he said, "that I have no right to ask, and to show you a letter that I think you have got a right to see. And I am sorry, ma'am. I have been 3 months making up my mind, and I have got a wife and a boy and another coming, and I would rather have gone on not knowing. But I do know, and now you will have to." Any woman with sense sends that young man away. I want you to understand what I had in my hand at that moment. I had a daughter's wedding 11 months off to a banker's son in a town of 4,000 people who had nothing to do all winter but watch each other. I had a husband who was about to become rich. I had a house on Ridge Street and a pew and the presidency of the Ladies' Committee of the Onondaga Home for Indigent Women. And if I had said, "I am sorry, you have the wrong house," and shut that door, I believe with my whole heart that Nelson Prue would have put his hat on and walked back to the depot, and I would never have heard his name again. I stood in the doorway of my own house with the thaw dripping off the porch roof, and I looked at my husband's chin on a stranger's face, and I said, "Come in out of the wet." That is where the 19 years ended, not with the letter, with the door. I put him in the morning room and not the parlor, which tells you exactly how much of a lady I still was at that moment. And I shut both doors, and I sent Verity for the tea things, and she brought them herself instead of sending the girl, and she set them down and did not leave until I looked at her. He would not sit until I did. Then he took an envelope out of his breast pocket. It had been carried a long way and folded once against the rule, and he smoothed it on his knee before he handed it to me. "That was my mother's," he said. "She kept it 13 years, and she died in 1883, and I have had it 6 years since. I have read it maybe 400 times, and I want to tell you before you open it that I do not think my mother was a wicked woman, and I would be obliged if you would keep that in your mind while you read it. What was your mother's name? Iva Prue, he said. Her father was foundry foreman at Beckwith's in Utica. She was in service after he died, and then she kept house for a gentleman above the railroad office on Genesee Street from 68 to 71. The tea was on the table between us and going cold, and neither of us touched it once. And who was the gentleman? Nelson Prue looked at me with my husband's chin and my husband's coloring around the eyes, and none of my husband's ease, and he said, "Ma'am, I believe you know, and if I am wrong, I will take the letter and go, and be glad of it, gladder than you would credit." I turned the envelope over. There was no address on it, and no stamp. It had never gone through the mail. The flap had been opened long ago, and the wax was gone, and there was a smell off it of a trunk, and of some sachet a woman had used, lavender gone stale, and I have never since been able to have lavender in a drawer. I got it open. There were 2 sheets, folded, of that heavy, cream-laid paper with the decal that my husband's father had bought by the ream for the company, and that stood in the desk in the library of my own house until 1879. And at the top, in my husband's hand, that hand I knew better than my own, the long looping H, the way he crossed a T with a little downward flick, like a man striking a match, was written, Utica, the 4th of March, 1871. My wedding day was the 19th of October, 1870. I am going to give you that letter the way I read it, which is to say slowly, because I could not get through it the first time without going back. It began, "My own dear wife. Not my dear Iva, not my dearest girl, my own dear wife." And under it, 4 lines about the weather in Corliss Falls and a horse that had gone lame, in the ordinary domestic way a man writes to a woman he expects to see on Saturday. Then this, and I have it by heart, and will have it by heart when I have forgotten my children's faces. You are not to fret over what mother said to you in the street. She has no power in this that I do not give her, and she shall not have it long. You are my wife before God, and before the man that heard us say it, and that is a thing done, and not to be undone by any woman's tongue or any lawyer's paper. I ask you only to be patient with me until the summer, when I will have the business in my own hands, and can say it out loud in my own house. And then, farther down, after some talk of money and a doctor's bill, you must not think of the other. That is a matter of the road and the bank and my father's promises, and it is nothing beside what we are. He signed it, your own H. I read it sitting in my morning room with the fire going, and a young man watching me from 4 feet away, and the first thing I felt was not what you would expect. It was not grief, and it was not rage. It was a kind of dreadful embarrassment, as though I had opened a door on a stranger undressing. Those were my husband's words, in my husband's hand, and they were not addressed to me, and I had no business reading them. And it took perhaps 30 seconds for that to turn into what came next. The date was the 4th of March, 1871. I had been married on the 19th of October, 1870, in the Presbyterian Church in Corliss Falls, with 160 people in the pews and my father in the front row. I said, out loud, in a voice that sounded reasonable, "This is dated after my wedding." "Yes, ma'am." 4 months and a half after. "Yes, ma'am." And he calls her his wife in March, when he had a wife on Ridge Street since October. I put the sheets down on the tea table and squared them with my fingers, and I noticed that my hands were doing that neatly, the way they would square a napkin. "Then your mother was his mistress, Mr. Prue, and he lied to her, and he called her a wife to quiet her, and I am very sorry for it, and I am sorry for you. But that is what this paper is." I said that. I wanted in the record that I said that, sitting in a silk chair with a fire behind me, about a dead woman, to her son. Nelson Prue did not flare up. He sat with his hands on his knees and let me finish, and then he said, quietly, "That is what I said too, ma'am, for 4 years. That is exactly what I said." And then I went and looked. Looked at what? At what a man means when he says, "The man that heard us say it." He leaned forward. "Ma'am, I am not a clever man, and I am not schooled beyond the 8th grade. And I drew plans for a machine works for 6 years, and I know how to read a thing that is drawn. That letter is not a lover's letter. Look at it again. He is not begging her to believe him. He is telling her not to worry about a thing that has already happened. Before the man that heard us say it. That is not sweetheart talk. That is a man talking about a ceremony. The fire dropped a coal. I remember the sound of it. "There is no ceremony," I said. "He was married to me. In 1871, yes." "What do you mean, in 1871? And Nelson Prue said, "I mean, my mother told me on her deathbed that she was married to my father in June of 1868 in a meeting house on Bleecker Street in Utica by a preacher named Dunmore, with 2 witnesses out of the foundry, and that there was a book with it wrote down in, and that a lawyer came in the fall of '70 and bought the book off the trustees for the meeting house roof. She was dying and full of morphia, and I did not believe one word of it. I have not believed it for 6 years. I am here because in October I went to Bleecker Street to prove it was a dying woman's dream, and it is not. I did not faint, and I did not weep. What happened to me was that the room went a long way off, and I could see Nelson Prue perfectly well, but the sound of his voice was arriving late, like a man chopping wood across a field. And there was something wrong with my mouth, a taste like a penny held under the tongue. If a man in the state of New York stood up before witnesses in 1868 and took a woman as his wife, and she took him as her husband, then in the eye of the law of that state, they were married. It did not want a license. It did not want a steeple. My father had explained that very thing to me once at his own dinner table when I was a girl, in a case about a pension, and I had thought it a curiosity. If that were true of Hollis Merriwether and Iva Prue in 1868, then on the 19th of October, 1870, in front of 160 people and a judge. My husband had committed bigamy, and my marriage was a nullity. And my daughter, who was to be married in the Presbyterian Church on the 2nd of December, was a bastard. And so were my sons. And so was I, in the only sense that mattered to a town of 4,000 people. "Ma'am," Nelson Prue said from very far away, "put your head down. I am quite well. You are the color of that curtain. Put your head down, and I will pour the tea, and it will be cold, and it will do you good anyhow." He poured me cold tea in my own house, and I drank it. And he sat back down and waited. And that is when I understood that this young man was better bred than my husband, and that he had thought about this afternoon for 3 months, and that he had almost certainly rehearsed the part where I told him his mother was a whore, and had decided in advance to let me say it. "Why now?" I said. "You have had the letter 6 years. Why come to me in January of this year?" 2 reasons, and I will give you the bad one first. He looked at the fire. In November, a man came to my house in Utica. He did not give a name. He said he was inquiring on behalf of an estate, and did I have any papers of my mother's, and would $25 be of use to me? My wife told him no, we had nothing, and shut the door. And that is when I knew it was worth something to somebody, ma'am, and that they had found where I was living. And the good reason? "The good reason is my boy is 3, he said, "and they will not stop with the papers." Now, I am going to be honest with you about the next 8 weeks, because if I skip them, you will think me a better woman than I was. I did not go to my husband. I did not go to my father, who was living then and had 2 years yet. I did not go to a lawyer. What I did was arithmetic. I sat up that night in the library after the house was down, with the letter in my lap and the fire dying and a candle at my elbow, and I made a column of dates on the back of a bill from the dressmaker, and I did the only thing I could think of, which was to try to make that paper mean something bearable. 1868. Where was Hollis in 1868? He was 26. He was in Utica. His father had put him in the freight office of the connecting line to learn the business from the bottom, and he lived there from the spring of 68 to the autumn of 70. I knew that. Everybody knew that. There was a joke in the family about Hollis's Utica years, about how his mother went down on the cars once a month, and how he came home in the fall of 70, reformed and ready to be married. And old Mr. Beckwith said it at our wedding breakfast, and everyone laughed, and I laughed with them. I was 20 years old, reformed and ready to be married. I sat in my library with that sentence going around in my head like a wasp in a jar. So the dates fit. That was the first thing I proved, sitting alone at 1 in the morning. And I remember thinking quite calmly, well, that is the end of that hope, and moving on to the next. The next was the letter itself. And here is where the arithmetic turned on me, and I will show you how, because it is the thing that took me from a woman who was frightened to a woman who was dangerous. The letter is dated the 4th of March, 1871. In March of 1871, I was 5 months a wife and 3 months with child with Lorena. If that letter is honest, if Hollis truly wrote that on that day, then he was married to me in October and calling another woman his wife in March, which is vile, but which is only adultery. And adultery does not unmake a marriage or a child. But I had that paper in my hand, and I had a fire in front of me, and I looked at it for a long time, and there was something about the top line that I could not leave alone. The ink of the date was not the ink of the letter. It is the sort of thing you cannot see until you have looked at a thing 40 times. The body of that letter is in a black ink gone brown with age, the ink my husband's father bought for the company by the quart. The date at the top, Utica, the 4th of March, 1871, sat a shade darker. And the pen that wrote it had a finer point, and the loop of the 7 leaned differently than the 7s in the body of the letter, and there was a faint smudge under the Y in 70 where a thumb had been. Somebody had put that date on afterward. I sat back in my chair in the dark house with my heart going like a bird in a box. Because think what it means. A false date on a true letter is not something a jealous woman does. It is not something a dying woman in Utica does to comfort herself. Only one kind of person alters the date on a document, and that is a person who needs it to say a particular thing on a particular day in front of a particular audience. A person who wants a paper that proves adultery, because adultery is survivable, sitting on top of a paper that would have proved a marriage, which is not. Somebody had taken a letter that damned my husband and made it into a letter that merely shamed him. And Iva Prue had kept it 13 years and died with it. And her son had carried it 6 years, believing it was the worst thing in the world. And it was not the worst thing in the world. It was the cover on the worst thing in the world. I went up the stairs at 2:30 in the morning, past the stained glass that had no colors in it at that hour, and along the hall to the room where my husband was asleep, on his back, with one arm thrown up over his head, the way he had slept for 19 years. And I stood in the doorway in my wrapper, with a candle in my hand, and looked at him for I do not know how long. I did not wake him. I have been asked since, why not? And the true answer is not a noble one. I did not wake him because I did not yet know which question to ask. And I understood. I had understood since about 11 o'clock that night that I would get exactly one question in that house before every door in it closed against me forever, and that the person who would close them was not sleeping in that bed. She was 2 doors down, in the south room with the bay window, and she was 71 years old, and she had bought a church register in the autumn of 1870. For 3 weeks after that night, I did nothing at all. And I would like to tell you it was cunning. It was not. It was fright of a particular kind that I have since heard described by other women, and that nobody warns a girl about. I was afraid that if I moved, I would find out that the life I had been living was not merely spoiled, but had never existed, and that everything in it, the pew, the committee, the carriage block with our name on it, the way the butcher's boy took his cap off to me, had been lent to me by somebody who could take it back. So I went on. I went to the ladies' committee on the second Tuesday. I ordered the coal. I let Lorena talk to me about orange blossom and about whether Wyatt's aunt from Rome must be asked. I sat at dinner opposite my husband and listened to him tell the table what the systems men had said about our rolling stock. And I watched him. That is the part I did not expect, and that I would warn any woman about if she asked. When you have had a thing like that put into your hand, and you have not yet spoken, you begin to watch, and everything you see is evidence, and you cannot stop. I watched him ask Ansel about his Latin. I watched him take a second helping of pudding. I watched him say to Minta on the 11th of February that she was his own good girl. And I sat there with my fork in my hand and thought, in the middle of my own dining room, he said that to a child in Utica. He must have. Men do not learn a new way of speaking to children. I had to put my napkin down and go out into the hall. The thing that broke my paralysis was not courage. It was a ledger, and it came to me in the ordinary course of my week, which is the cruelest way these things ever come. I must explain the fund, and I am sorry to slow the story for it, but without it, you will not understand what happened in that office on the 26th of February. And it is the hinge of my whole life. When my husband's father died in 1876, he left, along with everything else, a thing called the Corliss Falls and Southern Employees Relief Fund. Every road of any size had one. Men were killed on those lines with a regularity we did not think remarkable. A brakeman between cars, a man off a trestle, a boiler. And there was no law then that made a company pay $1 to the widow. And so the good roads kept a fund, and the bad ones did not. And it was a point of family pride with the Merriwethers that ours had been kept since 1864. The fund paid pensions, $7 a week to a widow with children, $4 to a widow without, $3 to a man crippled and living with kin. It paid a burial. It paid a doctor. And it was administered by a committee of 3, the general manager of the road, who was Rand Gillum, the treasurer's clerk, and one lady of the family who signed the quarterly schedule of payments before it went to the bank. That lady had been Ora Merriwether from 1864 until 1881. From January of 1881, it was me. I want you to understand that this was the achievement of my life. I do not say that bitterly. I say it because it is true, and because it explains everything I did after. I was 31 years old when Ora came down one morning and said, in front of Hollis, "Cordelia had better take the fund. My eyes are not what they were." And I went upstairs and shut my door and cried for pure pleasure. In 19 years, it was the only piece of that family's business that was ever put into my hands. 4 times a year, I went down to the office by the depot, and Rand Gillum brought me the schedule, a long sheet, ruled, 30 or 40 names with the amounts against them. And I read it, and I signed at the bottom, Cordelia V. Merriwether, and the bank paid on my signature. I took it seriously in the way a woman takes seriously the one thing she is allowed to do. I knew those names. When the Onondaga Home for Indigent Women wanted a subscription, I could tell them which of our widows had gone in there. I sent Christmas baskets by that list. I knew that Mrs. Wandell at Lyle had 6 children, and that her eldest had gone to the glassworks at 14 because I had asked. On the 26th of February, I went down to sign the schedule for the first quarter, and while Rand Gillum was out of the room, I turned back the pages of the letter book on his desk, which I had no business doing, and looked for the name Prue. I did not expect to find it. I want to be honest. I went there to prove Nelson Prue a liar in the one particular I could check. Because if a lie could be found anywhere in his account, I could pull the whole thing down and go back to being who I had been on the 8th of January. The letter book had nothing, but the pension schedules were bound by year in a cupboard behind the door, 1 volume for each 5 years, and I had signed 8 years of them. And I got down 1881, and I opened it on the desk, and I ran my finger down the 3rd page. There it was, in the clerk's copperplate, in a column I had signed my name under 4 times a year for 8 years. Prue, I, widow of foreman, Utica, $7. I have been asked what I felt. Here is what I felt. Nothing at all, for about 4 seconds. And then my ears began to ring, and then a heat came over my scalp so sudden and so complete that I put my hand up to my own head to see whether the lamp had set my hair alight. Because I knew that name on that sheet, not as a stranger's. I knew it the way you know a thing you have read 40 times without seeing it. The way you know the pattern in a carpet you have walked over for years. Prue I. It had been in every schedule I ever signed. It was above Ranney and below Ostrander, in the same place on the page, quarter after quarter after quarter. And I had read it out and set my pen to the bottom of the sheet, and I had never once asked what foreman or which shop or when he had died, because the fund had 40 widows on it, and they were all somebody's foreman's widow. $7 a week is the rate for a widow with children. I turned back to 1876, which was the earliest bound volume in that cupboard, and it was there in 1876, in Ora's hand at the bottom. I went forward, year by year, with my finger going down the page and my breath coming short, and Rand Gillum's voice audible in the outer office, talking to somebody about a switch engine. Prue I, Prue I, Prue I, $7. And then, in the 3rd quarter schedule of 1883, in the clerk's same fine copperplate, at the end of the line, struck, deceased, the 9th of August. My signature was at the bottom of that sheet. Cordelia V. Merriwether. In my own long looping hand, the one my governess had drilled into me in ink on the 11th of October, 1883. I had signed the paper that struck her off. I want to tell you exactly what I did next, because it is the only thing in this entire history that I am proud of. I did not put the book back. I took the sheet for the 3rd quarter of 1883 and the sheet for the 1st quarter of 1881 out of the binding, using a paper knife off Rand Gillum's own desk, cutting them close to the stitching, and I folded them small and put them in my muff. Then I put the volumes back in the cupboard and shut the door, and sat down in the chair by the window and put my gloves on. When Rand Gillum came back, I signed his schedule for the quarter with a steady hand and asked him about his wife's neuralgia. Then I said, "Mr. Gillum, how long has the fund paid the widow Prue at Utica?" He was 52 years old, and he had been on that road since he was a boy of 14, carrying water to the graders. And he stopped with the blotter in his hand. "That would be paid off some years back, Mrs. Merriwether." "I know when it was paid off. I signed it off. I am asking how long it was paid." "Since before my time in this office." "Mr. Gillum, you have been in this office since '69. And Rand Gillum set the blotter down, very carefully on the desk, in the exact center, the way a man does when he wants his hands to have something to do. And he said, "Ma'am, I would take it kindly if you would ask Mr. Hollis that." "I am asking you." "Then I will say this much, and I will not say any more today." He looked at the window. "There is no foreman Prue ever worked for this road. Not in the shops, not on the section, not at the freight house. I looked it up myself in 1879 when I took the accounts over, because it did not sit right with me. And when I asked, I was told by Mrs. Ora Merriwether that it was a charge her husband had undertaken personally, and that I was to carry it and not inquire. And I have carried it and not inquired for 14 years, and it has been on my conscience for every one of them. And if you want it out of me, you shall have it, but you will have to ask me in a way that I can answer." "What way is that?" "In front of a lawyer," said Rand Gillum, "or in front of the board." I went home and up to my room and shut the door, and told Verity Cobb through it that I had a headache, and I lay on the bed in my clothes with my boots on, which I had not done since I was a girl, and stared at the ceiling until it got dark. $7 a week. 13 years. $200 was what a lawyer had given Iva Prue to leave Utica in the autumn of 1870, if Nelson had it right. And then $7 a week from the company relief fund forever after, paid out of a charity built for men crushed between freight cars, and signed for at the last by the second wife who thought she was doing good in the world. That is the piece of it that I could not swallow then and cannot swallow now. Not the money. Any man can pay money. It was that they had used me for it. It was that the one duty they had ever given me had been given so that my name would be at the bottom of that page. Verity Cobb came in at 6:30 without knocking, which she had never done, and set down a cup of beef tea and stood by the bed in the dark. "Ma'am," she said, "you went to the office today." I did not answer her. "When you are ready to hear it," said Verity Cobb. "I was in this house in the autumn of 1870, and I carried up the trays, and I know what was said in the south room, and who came down from Utica on the cars. And I know what Mr. Pruitt was sent for, and what he brought back in a valise. I have kept it 30 years, because I had nowhere to go, and a mother to keep. My mother has been dead 11 years. She straightened the cloth on the tray. I am 66 years old, and I have $1,200 in the savings bank, and there is nothing in this world they can do to me. I sat up with Verity Cobb until 1 in the morning, in the housekeeper's room in the basement of my own house, with the door bolted and a candle between us and the coal settling in the range. And she told me the autumn of 1870 from the beginning. She told it the way a servant tells a thing, which is by furniture and by trays. The first I knew of it, she said, was in June, when Mrs. Ora had me turn out the little bedroom at the end of the passage and put clean linen on it, and then she never used it. That room was got ready for a person that never came. And a week after that, Mr. Lucian Pruitt came up in the evening, and they sat in the south room with the doors shut from 8 until near midnight. And I took up the tray at 9, and the whiskey was untouched, and there was a paper on her knee, and she put her hand over it when I came in. That was the 14th of June, because it was the day the bell was hung at the Methodist church here, and we had it all afternoon. What paper? I never saw it, ma'am. I only know that from that night forward, Mr. Pruitt came twice a week, and he had never come twice a month before. And Mrs. Ora took her breakfast downstairs, which she never did in her life. And she was at that desk in the morning room with the letter book from 8 until 11. And she wrote to Utica. And I know she wrote to Utica, because I carried the letters out to the box myself, and I have got eyes. Verity, did a woman ever come to this house? The old woman put her hands flat on the table. In September, she said, the 22nd. Mr. Hollis was at Albany with his father. She came on the noon cars, and she walked up from the depot in the rain because there was no fly at the stand. And she stood at that side door where the ash cans are, because she knew better than to come to the front. And she asked for Mrs. Merriwether. And I said, which one? And she said, the mother. I could not speak. She was about your age now, ma'am, or younger, 3 or 4 and 20, dark. She had a wet cloak, and her boots were through, and she was in the family way, 5 months or 6, and she stood in my kitchen and would not sit down, and she said, I will not sit until I know whether I am to be put out. And I gave her tea, and she drank 2 cups of it, and never said another word to me. And then Mrs. Ora came down and took her into the little back parlor and shut the door, and they were in there 50 minutes. Did you hear it? I heard some. Verity Cobb looked at the candle. I heard the girl say, we are married, ma'am, and I have got the paper of it. And I heard Mrs. Ora say, in that voice, you have got no paper, my dear. And if you had one, it would be a bill of sale on yourself. And then it went quiet, and I could not hear. And then I heard the girl crying, and then it was quiet a long time. And then Mrs. Ora came out and told me to fetch Elam with the trap and take the young person to the 6 o'clock cars and to give her the parcel from the hall table. What was in the parcel? Money, ma'am, said Verity Cobb. I had it in my 2 hands, and I know what money feels like in paper. And a railway envelope with it, the long kind, for a ticket. I sat there in the basement of that house with the smell of blacking and cold soot around me, and I asked the question that I had come down 2 flights of stairs at midnight to ask. Did my husband know she came? And Verity Cobb said, he came home on the Friday, and on the Saturday he had a letter, and he went off to Utica on the early cars and stopped away 4 days. And when he come back, he was white as this candle, and he did not speak at table. And on the Sunday after that, they gave out your engagement in the church. There it is. That is the whole architecture of my life in one paragraph, from a woman who carried trays. And in the autumn, I said, Mr. Pruitt went to Utica in October, and he was away 3 days, and when he come back, I unpacked his valise myself, because he had it sent up to the south room, and Mrs. Ora rang for me to take it down again after. And there was a book in it, ma'am, a long book with a marbled cover and a strap, the kind they keep a register in, and it went into the fire in the south room, because I laid that fire the next morning, and there was a brass corner piece in the ashes, and a deal of black leaf. And I picked the corner piece out with the tongs, and I have got it yet. She went to the dresser and took down a tin and put it on the table, and out of the tin she took a small triangle of tarnished brass, 1.5 inches along the sides, with 2 little nail holes in it, and a bit of blackened leather still stuck to the back. I picked it up. It was nothing. It was a scrap of hardware, and it was, I understood, the reason that a young man had come up my steps in January, because whoever burned that book had believed for 19 years that the thing was finished. Verity, I said, why did you keep this? Because I have been in service since I was 11 years old, she said. And the one thing you learn is that they never burn all of it. And someday somebody comes asking, and it is better to have the answer in a tin than to have nothing but your word against theirs. I went to Utica on the 4th of March. I told the house I was going to Syracuse for the wedding shopping, and I took Lorena with me as far as Syracuse, and left her with my cousin at 10 in the morning with a list, and I got back on the eastbound cars alone, with my heart pounding in my throat like a girl running away. And I was in Utica at 1:30 in the afternoon. I had not traveled alone in 19 years. Bleecker Street was as Nelson Prue had described it. The meeting house was a plain wooden building with a squared belfry and no steeple, painted the color of oatmeal, wedged between a harness shop and a 3-story brick block. And it had ceased to be a Methodist meeting house in 1874 and had been a Welsh chapel since 1881. And there was a notice board out front in a language I could not read. The chapel keeper was a small, elderly Welshman named Ethel Vaughan, who spoke perfectly good English and who was suspicious of me for about 90 seconds, and then, when I said the words register and 1868, went almost gentle, the way people do when they see that you are past pretending. "There's people come for that," he said, "one every few years. There's no books here from that time, ma'am. When the Methodists sold, the trustees took what they had, and half of it went to the district, and half went home in men's houses. But you'll want Mr. Dunmore." "He is living?" "He is living," said Ethel Vaughan, "and he is 74 years old, and he lives with his daughter on Steuben Street, and he has all his wits. And I will tell you now, before you walk up there, he will not be pleased to see you." I walked to Steuben Street in the cold with my hands inside my muff and the 2 cut pension sheets in there against my palm. The Reverend Josiah Dunmore was in a chair by a window with a rug over his knees and a Bible face down on the sill. And he was one of those old men who have gone dry and hard rather than soft, with a big, raw-boned face and white eyebrows like a hedge. His daughter brought me in, and he looked at me for a long moment and said, "You're the Merriwether woman." "I am Mrs. Hollis Merriwether." "That is what I said." He worked his mouth. "Sit down. You are 19 years late, and it is not your fault. and I have been waiting for somebody out of that family to walk in this door since Grant's first term, and I did not think it would be a woman, and I ought to have known it would be. I sat down. I will tell you what I told the lawyer in 1870, said Josiah Dunmore, which is that I was ordained in 1841, and I have kept a register for every day of my ministry, and I have never made a false entry in it. And if the Corliss Falls and Southern Railroad wants the entry for the 20th of June, 1868, they may have a certified copy of it for $1. And if they want it burned, they may go to hell for nothing. The room was quite hot. There was a canary in a cage in the corner. He came to you, I said. Mr. Pruitt. He came to the trustees, which was the cunning of it. A lawyer with money for a roof. Our roof was a sieve, and our trustees were 4 men out of the foundry and a grocer, and they let him have the book of the meeting house for the roof and never asked what he wanted with it, or told me until it was gone. He burned it. I have no doubt in the world that he burned it. The old man leaned forward and put his finger on the arm of my chair. But the meeting house register is the record of the meeting house. It is not my register. I kept my own book from the day of my ordination. Every baptism, every burial, every marriage I ever performed, wherever I performed it. And it is my property, and it goes where I go. And it was on the shelf over my head in the parsonage on Bleecker Street on the day that man walked into it. And he never thought to ask, because a lawyer thinks a church is a building. He turned his head toward the door and shouted his daughter's name, and it went through my skull like a bell. She brought it in and put it in my lap. It was a quarto book, in a black cover gone gray at the corners, with the years lettered on the spine in a young man's careful hand. And it fell open near the middle because it had been opened at that place many times before. And I understood from that alone that I was not the first person to sit in that chair. 20th of June, 1868. I am going to give it to you exactly, and it is 9 lines, and I have never needed to look at my copy to say them. Hollis A. Merriwether, of Corliss Falls, Onondaga County, aged 5 and 20, and Iva Prue, of this city, aged 20, having declared before me, and before the witnesses hereunder, that they took one another as husband and wife, and there being no impediment shown, I recorded the same this day, no license being had, at the party's desire, the said Hollis A. Merriwether being under age of his father's consent in the matter of his expectations. Witnesses: Owen Prue, foundryman; V. A. Cobb, servant. And under it, in the same hand but paler ink, added later, Memorandum: on the 11th of October, 1870, one Lucian Pruitt, attorney, of Corliss Falls, offered me $100 for this page, and I refused him, and told him that I would keep it against the day it is wanted. J.D. I read it through twice. The second time the print went crooked and slid, and I could not fix my eyes on it, and there was a roaring in my ears like standing under a trestle with a freight going over. And I heard the old man say something to his daughter. And then I was leaning forward with my head almost on my knees, and the book sliding off my lap, and his daughter's hand flat between my shoulder blades saying, "Breathe, my dear, breathe out. Out is what you want, not in." I did not weep. I have not wept once in this entire business, and I have wondered whether something in me is defective. What I did was shake. It came up through my hands and my arms and my jaw so that my teeth clicked, and it went on for some minutes, and the canary went on singing, and old Josiah Dunmore sat in his chair with his hands on the rug and let it run its course without one word of comfort, which was, I think now, exactly right. When I could speak, I said, V.A. Cobb, the girl's friend, servant girl out of a house in Corliss Falls, come down to stand up with her. He shrugged. She'd be an old woman now if she is alive. Verity Ann Cobb. She was alive, and she was in my house, and she had been carrying up trays in it for 30 years, and she had signed that book at 22 years old, the year before she ever came to Ridge Street. And she had sat with me in the basement 3 nights before and had not told me that part. There is only one reason a woman leaves that out. She had not left it out to protect the Merriwethers. She had left it out because on the day I finally went and looked, she wanted the register to tell me in the register's own words, and not to be a servant's story that a lady could choose not to believe. I came home on the last cars with a certified copy of 9 lines in my reticule, signed by Josiah Dunmore, and witnessed by his daughter and by Ethel Vaughn, for which the old man would not take $1. And I spoke to my husband on the 19th of April. I chose the day. That is a thing I would tell any woman. Choose the day and choose the room, and do not let it come at you in a hall. The 19th was a Friday, and it rained all day, and Ora had gone to Syracuse for 2 nights to her sister's, which she did twice a year, and Lorena was at the Thatchers', and I sent Ansel and Minta to my brother's for supper, and I told the cook we should want nothing after 8. I had the library fire lit. I sat in the chair on the far side of the hearth, which was his chair, and I let him find me in it. He came in at 8:30 with the newspaper under his arm and stopped. "You're in my chair." "I know it. Shut the door, Hollis." He shut the door, still smiling, and stood with his back to it, and I watched the smile go through 3 or 4 different shapes, trying to find one that fit. I did not shout. I had rehearsed it for 6 weeks, and I had cut it down until it would fit in 3 sentences, because I had learned something about my husband in 19 years, which was that if you gave him room, he would fill it with talk until you were the one apologizing. On the 20th of June, 1868, I said, in a meeting house on Bleecker Street in Utica, you took Iva Prue as your wife in front of the Reverend Josiah Dunmore and 2 witnesses. He wrote it in his own book. Mr. Pruitt tried to buy the page in October of 1870, and Dunmore refused him and wrote that refusal in the margin. Dunmore is alive. I sat with him on the 4th of March, and I have a certified copy in this house. The rain went on the window. Hollis Merriwether's face did a thing I had never seen a face do. It went in about 2 seconds from a man to a boy, not softer, but younger, the way a face goes when the person behind it stops being 47 and becomes 25. And I understood that I was not looking at my husband at all. I was looking at the man who lived over the freight office on Genesee Street. He came and sat down across from me in my chair and put the newspaper on the floor. "Is he still living?" he said. "Dunmore." "That is your first question?" "No," he said. "It is my fourth. The first three I have been asking myself since 1870. "Then answer mine. Is it true?" And my husband said, "Yes." I had known it for 6 weeks. I had a certified copy of it in a locked box in my dressing room. And still, when he said that one word in that room with the rain on the glass, something went out of me. Some last piece of the 20-year-old girl in the Presbyterian church, and did not come back. "Say the rest," I said. There isn't any rest. I was 5 and 20, and I was in love, and my father would have cut me off, and Dunmore would not marry us without my father's word, and so we stood up and set it before him, and he wrote it down as a declaration, which he told us was as good as any marriage in this state. And it was. I knew it was. I have known it every day since. He rubbed his face with both hands. "Cordelia, I was going to bring her home. That letter you have got, I know you have got it. Prue wrote me in November. I meant every word in that letter the day I wrote it. The letter is dated March of 71. The letter was written in June of 1870, he said. 4 months before I married you." There it was, said out loud, by him, without my having to lay a hand on it. Who changed the date? Pruitt. When? In 84, he said, after Iva died, when the boy was of age and there began to be talk of the boy. Pruitt got it from a woman Iva had lodged with, who had it out of her box before the funeral, and he paid her, and he brought it to my mother, and my mother had him alter it and put it back into the world. He looked at the fire. So that if it ever came out, it would come out as a sin and not as a bigamy. She said, I can give you her words. She said, Hollis, a man's mistress is a 9 days' talk, and a man's first wife is a lawsuit that lasts a generation. Then he did not know he was selling it back to Nelson Prue's mother's people? He knew exactly. He put it back into the boy's hands on purpose, altered, so that when the boy went off half-cocked with it, the only paper in the world would be one that proved nothing. My husband smiled without any pleasure whatever. My mother is the ablest person I have ever known. If she had been a man, she would have had a system of her own by now, and I would have been her clerk. I sat with that for a while. Hollis, I said, the fund. He went gray. It is a thing you read in books, and I had never seen it. The color going out of a man's face in bands from the forehead down. That was mine, he said. That was not hers. I want that said. When my father died in 76, I had the road, and I had nothing of my own, and she, Iva, was in Utica with the boy taking in sewing, and I could not send her money out of my own account because every dollar in this family goes through that woman's hands. And so I put her on the fund as a foreman's widow, and Gillum carried it, and that is what I did instead of being a man. I signed those schedules for 8 years. I know it. You gave me that fund. My mother gave you that fund, he said. In 81, when I told her I meant to go to Utica and see the boy and provide for him openly. He looked up at me at last. I never worked out until this minute whether she did it to gag me or to make you an accessory. Both, I expect. She does not do a thing for one reason. And that, may God forgive me, was the moment I began to be angry. Not at him, not yet. At her. Why did you not tell me, I said, in 19 years? Not in 71 when I was carrying Lorena, and not in 76 when your father died, and not in 83 when the woman died, and it was over, Hollis. It was over. She was dead, and there was no living wife, and you could have come to me and said, Cordelia, we must be married again, quietly, in another county, and no one need ever know. Do you know that? Do you know that we could have gone to Albany in 83 and been married in a registry and been safe? He did not answer for a long time. Yes, he said. Then why? Because to do that, said my husband, I should have had to tell you. And you would have looked at me the way you are looking at me now. And I had it arranged so that I need never see that. And I have kept it arranged for 19 years. And I am 47 years old, and I have never, in my life, done a hard thing on the day it wanted doing. That is the truest sentence Hollis Merriwether ever spoke. And he spoke it about himself, and it did not save him. Then he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and did what he had done all his life, which was to look for the arrangement that would let everybody stay comfortable. Now listen, he said, listen. It is not so bad as you think. Dunmore is 74. The register is in a private house. Nobody has seen that copy but you. The sale goes through in November, and I will have money in my own name for the first time in my life. Real money, not her money. And I will settle a sum on the Prue boy that will make him a rich man in Utica, and he will sign a paper. And Lorena will be married on the 2nd of December. And in a year, we shall be in New York, and none of this will follow us. And what am I to be in New York? My wife. I am not your wife, Hollis. Cordelia, I am not your wife. That is not a feeling. It is a fact. And it has been a fact since the 19th of October, 1870. And every soul in this house has known it but me. I stood up. Your children are illegitimate. Your daughter is to be married in 7 months to the son of a bank president who cares about nothing on this earth except family. And you are proposing to go to that wedding and stand up in that church and let that man take my daughter without telling him? What in God's name would you have me do? Announce it? I would have you remarry me, I said, next week, in a strange county, quietly, so that my children have a father-in-law, as well as in fact. And then I would have you go with me to Nelson Prue and put your name to his. And Hollis Merriwether said, I cannot marry you next week. Why not? Because it would be a public act, he said, and it would want a license, and a license is a public record, and the system's lawyers are going over every scrap of paper this family owns from now until November for the merger, and a second marriage between me and my own wife in the middle of it would be the end of the sale. They would smell it in a day. He spread his hands. after November. I give you my word. The day after the vote, we will go anywhere you like." I looked at him across my own hearth. "You have just told me," I said slowly, "that you will not put my children's name right until it is safe for your money." "That is not. Say it in some other words then. I will wait." He could not. He sat there and worked his mouth, and no other words came, because there were no other words. That was the shape of the thing. And it was the shape it had been in 1870 when he came back white as a candle from Utica and let them give out our engagement in church on the Sunday. I went up to bed, and I lay there, and I did not sleep at all. And somewhere around 4 a.m, I stopped thinking about my husband forever. I do not mean that unkindly. I mean that I set him down, the way you set down a piece of furniture you have been carrying. And I never took him up again. And everything after that was about the other people in the house. I went to Cordelia Merriwether on the 11th of May. I did not choose that room. She chose it. She sent for me. That is how it was done in that house. A maid at your door saying, "Mrs. Merriwether would be glad of you at 11. And I came up to the south room with the bay window, and she was in the chair by the light, with her work basket, hemming a handkerchief, 71 years old, in black wool, with her spectacles down her nose. "Sit down, daughter," she said. "You have been to Utica." There is no describing what it is to be 20 years frightened of a person, and then to find, on a Tuesday morning in May, that you are not frightened anymore. It was like putting down a valise. "I have," I said. "And you have seen the old man, and he has shown you his book, and you have got a copy of it. And it is not in this house, because you are not a fool." She took a stitch. "And now you have come up here to see whether I will lie to you. I shall not. It is a waste of a morning, and I have not got so many." "Then tell me one thing," I said. "Not the letter, and not the register, and not the money. One thing. You chose me. Of course I chose you. Why?" Cordelia Merriwether put her work down in her lap and looked at me over her spectacles with those small, dry eyes. And she gave me the truth. And it was worse than any lie she could have told. "Because your father was a judge," she said. "And because you were pretty and slow. And because a girl brought up in a judge's house believes that things are done properly and does not go looking behind them." My son had made a marriage in a shanty church with a foundryman's daughter, and there was going to be a child, and I had 11 weeks to put an unbreakable, respectable woman between that boy and that book. And I did it. And in 19 years, you have never once asked me a question I did not wish to answer, until this morning. You made my whole life a document. "I made your whole life," said my husband's mother, "and it has been a good one, and you have never wanted for anything, and your children are handsome and well-fed, and you may be as angry as you please, but you will not sit in my room and tell me you have been ill-used." "I want to know what I have," I said. That surprised her. I saw it, the smallest check in the hands, the needle held a half-second too long, and I understood that in 19 years I had never once asked that old woman a question about money. "You have your husband," she said. "I have no husband," Both of us in this room know it. I am asking what a woman in my position has, and I am asking the person in this house who knows the answer to the penny. Ora Merriwether looked at me for a while. "Ring for Pruitt," she said, "tomorrow at 3. And I will tell you now what he will tell you then, so that you may have the night to be sick in and not do it in front of him. You have nothing. The house is mine, deeded to me by my husband in 1872, and never out of my name. Hollis's shares are Hollis's, and Hollis owes $11,000 against them to the bank at Syracuse, which is why he wants this sale as badly as a drowning man wants a plank." She picked up her work again. "And your marriage settlement, which your father read and approved, and which you signed in this room on the 17th of October, 1870, 2 days before the wedding, contains a bar of dower. You gave up your widow's third for the sum of $4,000 settled on you at the date of the marriage, which was paid to your father's hands, and which your father invested for you in the Onondaga County Savings Bank, and which with the accumulations stands today, I should think, at about $7,000. And that, my dear, is what you have got. It is a great deal more than the girl in Utica had." I sat in that chair with my hands in my lap and understood at last why I had been made to sign a paper at 19 that nobody had read to me. Because a widow's third is a claim in a court, and a claim in a court is a hearing, and a hearing is a lawyer asking a witness under oath, "Madam, when was this lady married, and to whom, and can you produce the record?" They had not barred my dower to save $4,000. They had barred it so that I would never in my life have occasion to prove my own marriage. I saw Lucian Pruitt the next day at 3 in the library with the door open, because I would not sit alone with him behind a shut door, and I wanted the maids in the hall. He was 63, a smooth, dry, well-brushed man with a bald head and a very quiet voice. And he had been at every christening and every funeral of that family since before I was married into it. And he had carried Minta on his shoulders at a picnic in 1884. He told me about the settlement in the same voice a doctor uses for a diagnosis he has given 300 times. And when he had finished, I said, "Mr. Pruitt, in October of 1870, you offered the Reverend Josiah Dunmore of Utica $100 for a page out of his private register, and he refused you. And he wrote your name in the margin of that page in ink, and it is there this minute. I have never seen a man age in front of me before. He did not bluster. He was too able for that." He sat quite still for perhaps 10 seconds, and then he said, "Is he living?" "Everybody asks that first," I said. "It is remarkable. Yes." "Then I am in the hands of a woman of 19 years' good character," said Lucian Pruitt. "And I have been waiting for it a long while. And I find I am almost glad, which I did not expect." He took his spectacles off. "Mrs. Merriwether, I am going to tell you a thing that no consideration of my duty to my client can prevent me from telling you, because you are also my client, and have been since 1870, and no one in this family has ever remembered it. Say it." "There were 2 papers drawn in the summer of 1870, he said. One you have never seen, a deed of separation between Hollis Merriwether and Iva Prue, reciting a marriage between them by declaration in June of 1868, releasing all claims and providing for a payment of $200 and a weekly sum thereafter. It was drawn by me. It was never executed because Mrs. Ora would not have the marriage recited in writing on any account, and I told her that without the recital it was worth nothing, and she said that a paper worth nothing was exactly what she wanted the girl to sign, and the girl signed it in my presence at the depot at Utica on the 6th of October, 1870, with the recital struck out and initialed. And the draft with the recital in it is in my office in the deed box marked M 1870, said Lucian Pruitt, in my own hand, with my clerk's docket on the back, dated, and it has been there 19 years, and if I am asked for it in a proper proceeding, I shall produce it, and I shall be struck off. And that is what I have got to look forward to at 63. Why did you keep it? He put his spectacles back on. For the same reason your housekeeper kept a brass corner out of a fireplace, he said, because I did not want it to have been for nothing. Now I have to tell you about June, and about the 10 days when I very nearly let the whole thing go. Because if I leave that out, you will think I was a stronger woman than I am. Hollis came to me on the 2nd of June with a plan. He had been to Utica. He had gone without telling me, which I found out afterward, and he had sat in Nelson Prue's kitchen for 2 hours. And he came home and stood in my dressing room doorway with his hat in his hand, like a man calling on a lady. And he said, "I have seen my son." He had never in 19 years said that word in my hearing. He would not take money, Hollis said. He seemed dazed by it. I offered him $10,000, Cordelia, and he sat there in his shirt sleeves and told me his wife was making tea and would I care for a cup. And he said the only thing he wanted was for it to be written down somewhere that his mother had been an honest woman. And what did you say? I said I would do it. He turned the hat around. I mean to do it. I have thought of the way. After the vote in November, I shall have money of my own, and I shall be free of my mother. And I will make a declaration before a notary that I was married to Iva Prue by declaration in 1868, that she was my wife, that Nelson is my lawful son, and I will settle 1/3 of what I get on him. And then you and I will go to Albany and marry over again, and I will make Lorena's settlement out of my own money, so that it need not go through my mother's hands at all. I want you to understand how good that was. I want you to feel how good it was, sitting in a dressing room in June with the window open and the lilacs going over in the yard, to hear the man who had ruined you say the whole of the right thing in the right order, unprompted. I believed him. Not with my head. With my head, I did not believe one word. But there is another organ in a woman that goes on believing after the head has quit. And it kept me quiet for 10 days. On the 12th of June, my brother came to dinner. Ellery Vandeleur was 44 and in wool, and he had a house on the west side and a wife who was frightened of Ora and 4 children, and he was the only person in the world I had told. I had told him in April, the day after I spoke to Hollis, because I had to say it out loud to somebody with my own blood in them. He came early and asked me to walk out in the garden before dinner, and we went down between the currant bushes, and he said, "I have thought a great deal about what you told me, and I have prayed about it, and I want you to hear me out to the end before you speak." "Go on." "You must let it alone," said my brother. I stopped on the path. "Cordelia, look at what you are proposing. If this comes out, Lorena's engagement is broken inside a week, and no other man in this county will have her. And Ansel goes through the world as the son of a bigamist, and Minta will not be asked to a house in Corliss Falls when she is grown. And you will be a woman of 39 with $7,000 and no name at all. And for what? To do right by a chairmaker's family in Utica that has got along without us for 20 years. To do right by my own children. Your children are right," he said. "They are right as long as nobody says anything. That is what a name is, Cordelia. It is not a fact. It is a thing people agree to say." I looked at my brother in the June light and I said, "Who have you talked to?" He did not answer quickly enough. "Ellery, who?" "Mrs. Merriwether sent for me," he said, "in May. And she has proposed to buy the Vandeleur wool business into the family," said my brother, going red from the collar up, "as a settlement on Lorena at a valuation that is generous. And she has proposed to make me a director of the road before the sale, which would put $6,000 in my hands in November. And she said, Cordelia, she said it kindly. She said that a brother's steadiness at such a time is worth more to a woman than any lawyer. There is a moment in every one of these histories when the ground stops being ground. Mine was on a garden path between currant bushes, with the dinner bell about to go, looking at a man I had shared a nursery with. "She bought you," I said. "She has bought everybody," my brother said too loud, and then dropped his voice because we were out of doors. "That is what I am trying to make you see. Do you imagine you are the first person to find something out about that family? Gillum knows, Pruitt knows, Old Verity knows, the bank at Syracuse very likely knows. And every one of them has a reason to say nothing. And she made the reason herself, one at a time, over 30 years. And now she has made mine. And I am not strong enough. And I am telling you so to your face, rather than lying to you at your own table." To his credit, I have had a great many years to be fair about this, and I will be fair. He did tell me to my face. He is the only one of them who did. "Then eat your dinner and go home," I said, "and do not come to this house again until it is over." He did not. He came to the wedding. We are civil now. He is 71 years old, and he has a place at Cazenovia, and I go there at Christmas. And neither of us has ever said the word current in the other's hearing. And then, on the 28th of July, I found out what had become of Iva Prue. It came to me at the Ladies' Committee of the Ondaga Home for Indigent Women. That is the part I cannot get over, even now. Not in a courthouse, not from a lawyer, at a committee meeting, over the register of admissions, with the smell of tea and floor wax, from a good-natured woman named Mrs. Tenbrook, who had no idea on this earth what she was handing me. We were revising the bylaws for out-of-county cases, and she brought up the ledger of admissions to show me the precedents. And I turned the leaves back, And on the page for 1882, under the heading, Admitted on the Recommendation of a Subscriber, was written, Prue, Iva, of Utica, aged 40, consumption, recommended by Mrs. H. Merriwether. Removed to the infirmary the 2nd of June, 1883. Died the 9th of August, 1883. Buried at the charge of the home. Recommended by Mrs. H. Merriwether. There are 2 Mrs. H. Merriwethers in this county, and there always have been. And in the year 1882, the one who signed the recommendations at that home was Ora, because I did not join that committee until 84. But the ledger does not say Ora. The ledger says Mrs. H. Merriwether in a clerk's hand, and it will say that as long as the paper lasts. They had put her in a charity home. My husband's first wife, the mother of his eldest son, dying of consumption at 40 years old, had been taken out of her lodgings in Utica and put into an institution 20 miles from this house by the woman who ruined her on a subscriber's recommendation, written in a name that is also my name, and buried at the charge of the home, in the home's ground, which is a strip at the back of the Corliss Falls Cemetery with no stones on it, only numbered iron markers. And I have walked past it 4 times a year for 5 years on my way to my father-in-law's grave. And then, 7 weeks after they buried her, in the 3rd quarter schedule, I signed the sheet that struck her $7 off the fund. I sat in that committee room with the ledger open and Mrs. Tenbrook saying something about the bylaws, and I heard my own voice from a long way off, as pleasant as you like, say, "Yes, I think that will do very well. Shall we have the vote?" I got home at 4. I went up the stairs past the stained glass with the light coming through the lilies, green and amber, all down the steps. And Minta was on the landing in it with her hands out, catching the colors, and she said, "Mama, look, I am all over green." And I said, "So you are, my love." Then I went into my room and shut the door, and stood in the middle of the floor, and did not move for a long time. And what I thought, standing there, was not any of the things you would expect. What I thought was, they will do it again. Not to me, I was already done. To Lorena. In 11 years, when Wyatt Thatcher tires of her, or a better connection offers, some woman in some other house on some other hill will sit down with a lawyer and arrange my daughter into a corner she cannot get out of. And Lorena will not see it coming, because I did not, because my mother did not, because that is what we are raised for. Unless somebody in this family, once, in 3 generations, stands up in a room full of men and refuses to be arranged. I went to my desk and got out paper and wrote 3 letters, one to Rand Gillum, one to Lucian Pruitt, and one to Nelson Prue, chairmaker's kitchen and all at Utica, which began, "Dear Mr. Prue, I find that I am going to want your help, and that I am in a position to be of some use to you, and I would be obliged if you would come to Corliss Falls on Saturday and let me put a proposal to you." There were 16 weeks to the 12th of November. Here is what I understood by the middle of August, and it took me all summer to see it, and once I saw it, I never lost hold of it again. The whole family had been arranged around one belief, that the only weapon in the world was the register, and that the register was ash. Every single one of them, Ora, Hollis, Pruitt, my brother, thought I was a woman with a proof of an old marriage, and they were all quietly settling in to argue about a dead woman in Utica. But the men from the system did not care two straws whether my husband had been married in a shanty church in 1868. Buyers of railroads do not care about morals. They care about title. And a purchase of shares from a family in which there is one unacknowledged legitimate son who has never released his claim is not a clean title. It is a lawsuit waiting 19 years for a lawyer to notice it. Nelson Prue, sitting in his shirt sleeves in Utica, offering my husband a cup of tea, was, whether he knew it or not, an encumbrance on 1,100 shares of the Corliss Falls and Southern. And every day that got closer to the 12th of November, he was worth more. The men from the system would never let that go through if they knew. And they would find out, because the one thing certain about a sale of that size is that 100 people paw over the papers. So I did not need to break the sale. I only needed to be the person who decided whether it happened. I sat down at my desk with a sheet of paper on the 4th of August, and I wrote out what I actually wanted. And it took me 3 tries, and the third one was 6 lines long, and I carried it in my dress until November. First, a declaration under Hollis's hand and seal before a notary that he was married to Iva Prue by declaration in June of 1868, that she was his lawful wife until her death in August of 1883, and that Nelson Prue was his lawful son. Second, a stone on the home's ground with her name on it. Third, a settlement on Nelson out of the purchase money, and a release from him so that the sale could go through and no one after us would ever have to fight it. Fourth, the house on Ridge Street out of Ora's name and into mine. Fifth, my children's provisions settled in trust, with the trustee to be me in my own right and not through any man. And sixth, and this was the one I sat longest over, not a second marriage. I want to explain that because at the time it scandalized every person I told, including Pruitt, including Verity, and Nelson Prue actually stood up out of his chair. I could have gone to Albany with Hollis in December and been married quietly and been Mrs. Merriwether in law as well as in name, and every friend I have ever had would have said it was the sensible course. But listen to what it would have meant. A second ceremony in December of 1889 makes me his wife from December of 1889. It does not reach back and make Lorena legitimate. The law of this state at that time did not let a marriage reach backward over a child born under a void one. And it would have put on record in a clerk's office in Albany a marriage between 2 people who had already been married in 1870, which is the plainest confession of bigamy anybody ever left lying about. The thing that protected my children was not a new wedding. It was that, under the law as it stood, a child of a marriage entered into in good faith by an innocent party, and I was innocent, and could prove it by 19 witnesses and a settlement I signed at 19 without being allowed to read it, was not to be bastardized by the other party's fraud, provided somebody was willing to say so on the record before it was contested. Pruitt told me that. He told me on the 9th of August, standing at his own window with his back to me, And then he said, "But it has never been tried in this county, and if you are wrong, you will have said it out loud in front of the very men who would have to be told." "Then let us not be wrong," I said. I spent September and October getting 3 things. The first was Nelson Prue's signature on an agreement drawn by Lucian Pruitt, that he would make no claim against the shares nor against the estate in consideration of a sum to be settled on him at the sale, provided that the declaration of his mother's marriage was made and recorded first. First. Not at the same time. First. He came down twice. His wife Nettie came with him the second time, 7 months gone and worn out from the cars, and she sat in my morning room where her mother-in-law had never been allowed to sit, and drank tea out of my mother's cups. And when she was leaving, she said the only sharp thing anybody in that family ever said to me: "You have been very good to us, ma'am," considering that all he ever wanted was his mother's name spelled right on something. The second was Rand Gillum and the proxies. I have said the road was held by about 40 families. What that meant in practice was this: Ora had 410 shares. Hollis had 360 against which he owed the bank. The bank at Syracuse held 200, and the remaining 830 were spread among 38 holders in that valley: widows, 2 doctors, the Presbyterian Church's endowment, 4 farmers who had taken shares instead of cash for right-of-way in 1859, old Mr. Beckwith's daughters, small people who had never in 30 years been asked for anything but their signature on a proxy card sent out by the office each October. Rand Gillum had sent out those cards for 20 years. He knew every one of those holders. He had sat at their tables. And on the 9th of September, he came up to my house in the evening and stood in the hall with his hat in his hands and said, "Mrs. Merriwether, I have been 14 years carrying a thing I should not have carried. And if you will tell me plain what you mean to do with them, I will get you the cards." We got 29 of the 38, 611 shares. It took 7 weeks. I went myself in a hired trap to every one of those houses. I did not tell them the story, I want that understood, because it would have been the easiest thing in the world, and it would have been the same as telling the town. What I told them was that there was a question about the title to the road's shares that had to be settled before the sale, that their own money was in it, and that I meant to see it settled in the room on the 12th of November, and that I was asking them to let me hold their vote for one meeting. 19 of them signed on the strength of my father's name. I know that because they said so. My father, who had read that settlement in 1870 and approved it, and never asked why a bar of dower was wanted in the marriage of a railroad president's son. He died the next spring, and I never told him one word of it, and I have decided that was mercy and not cowardice, though I go back and forth. The third thing was the certified copies, and there were 4 sets of them, and I put one in the Onondaga County Savings Bank, one with a lawyer in Syracuse who had no connection with anybody, one with Nelson Prue at Utica, and one in an envelope in the hands of Josiah Dunmore, who wrote back to me in a hand like barbed wire. "Madam, I am 74 and in health, and I will be at Corliss Falls on the 12th of November at my own charge, and if they will not let an old man into the room, he may be got at the hotel across the way." The night of the 11th of November, I sat up in the library with the fire out. I had it all in a japanned box on the table. The letter with its altered date, the certified copy of the register, Pruitt's draft with the recital struck out and initialed by a dead girl, the 2 cut sheets from the pension schedules, the home's admission ledger entry copied and certified by the matron, the 29 proxy cards in a bundle with a tape round them, and the agreement with Nelson Prue's signature on it, wanting only the other. At about 11, Lorena came down. She was 18, and she was to be married in 3 weeks, and she stood in the doorway in her dressing gown with her hair in a plait and said, "You have been strange since the spring, and Papa has been strange, and Grandmother has been in her room for 4 days, and I am not a child, and I would like to be told." I looked at my daughter, and I did the thing my mother would not have done, and Ora would not have done, and my brother begged me not to do. I told her all of it in order from the 9th of January, and it took an hour and 10 minutes. I showed her the register copy. I told her what it meant about her own standing, in plain words, without softening it, and I told her what Wyatt's father would very likely do if he heard it from anybody but us. She sat on the arm of the chair, and she went white, and twice she got up and walked to the window and came back. At the end of it, she said, "Does Wyatt know?" "No." "Then I shall tell him tomorrow morning before you go down to that meeting," said Lorena. "Because if he is the kind of man who would give me up over a thing my father did before I was born, I had rather find it out on the 12th of November than on the 2nd of December. I have 3 children, and I have been proud of all of them, and I have never in my life been prouder than I was at midnight in that library." She told him at 9 the next morning in the Thatcher's front parlor with his mother present, which I had not expected and which she did on purpose. He did not give her up. He was a slow, decent, rather dull young man of 23, and he heard her out, and then he said, she told me this in the afternoon, "Well, it don't alter you any." And then he went and told his father himself, and Sherrod Thatcher, who cared about family more than any man in that county, put on his coat and came down to the meeting and sat in the back row of the director's room with his arms folded. And that, more than anything I brought in the box, is what broke Ora Merriwether. The directors met at 2 in the afternoon on the 12th of November in the boardroom over the freight office, which was a long room with a table for 11 and a stove and a picture of the founder in a gilt frame. There were 6 directors: Hollis, Ora, a doctor named Wisner, old Beckwith's son-in-law, the banksman from Syracuse, and my brother Ellery, sworn in as a director in September at Ora's contrivance, exactly as he had told me in the garden. There were also 4 men from the system and their lawyer, and a clerk, and Rand Gillum with the transfer books. I came in at 2:10, with Lucian Pruitt on one side of me, and Josiah Dunmore on the other, and Nelson Prue behind us in his good coat. And I put the japanned box on the table. The lawyer for the system stood up and said that this was a meeting of the board and not a public occasion. "I hold proxies for 611 shares," I said, "and I shall be obliged if you will inspect them before we go any further, because the vote you are here to take cannot be taken without them, and I am not going to give you the box until I have said what I came to say." The clerk counted the proxy cards for 11 minutes, while nobody in that room said one word. You could hear the stove. 611 shares against Aura's 410, my husband's 360, and the bank's 200. Not a majority. I had never needed a majority. I needed enough that the system's lawyer would have to look up from the table. And he did. And he said, "Madam, what is it you want?" "I want the board to hear one question read aloud and answered on the record before it votes. The question is whether the seller can give a clean title." The bank's man from Syracuse said, "Is there a claim?" "There is a claimant," I said, "and he is standing behind me, and he has signed a release which I have in this box, and I will hand it to you within the half hour if certain things are done in this room first. And if they are not done, he will not sign anything, and you may all go home." Hollis said, "Cordelia," in a voice I had not heard from him before, and I did not look at him. I have thought about that since. It cost me something not to look at him. He was my husband for 19 years by every measure but the law, and he had asked Ansel about his Latin, and he was sitting 8 feet from me watching the arrangement of his whole life come apart, and I did not turn my head. Ora Merriwether sat at the far end in black with her hands folded on the table. She had come down for it. She had not been in that boardroom in 4 years. "Mrs. Merriwether," said the system's lawyer, "who is the claimant?" "He is my husband's eldest son," I said. "Born in Utica in 1871 to Iva Prue, who was my husband's lawful wife by declaration made before the Reverend Josiah Dunmore on the 20th of June, 1868, 2 years and 4 months before my own marriage. Mr. Dunmore is beside me. The register in which he wrote it is in his hands. Mr. Pruitt, who is your seller's attorney and has been for 31 years, drew a deed of separation in 1870, reciting that marriage, and the draft with the recital is in his deed box, and he will produce it. The letter under my husband's hand calling her his wife is in this box, and the date at the top of it has been altered, and any man here may hold it to that window and see it. I do not know what 60 people would have sounded like. 11 men and 1 old woman sounded like nothing at all. Somebody's chair moved. "That is a great deal to say in public," said the lawyer carefully. "It is the only way it can be said," I said. Every quiet way was tried for 19 years, and every one of them was paid for out of a fund that pays widows of men killed on this road, and I signed the sheets. I took out the 2 cut pension schedules and laid them on the table, and then the copy of the home's admission ledger, and then, last, I said the thing I had come to say, and I said it to the old woman at the end of the table, and not to any of the men. "Mrs. Merriwether, in 1870, you bought a girl out of Utica for $200 and a ticket, and you bought a church register for a roof, and you bought my dower for $4,000. And in May, you bought my brother with a directorship, and every one of those purchases has been sitting on this company's books for 19 years without a line of entry. I have come to close the account." Ora Merriwether said, You have not the standing to close anything. I have 611 shares in my hand, I said, and the only release in the state of New York that this sale cannot be made without. And I have got something you have not got, madam, and you have known it since the 9th of January, and it is the reason you have been in your room 4 days. And what is that? I am no longer afraid of being talked about. The old woman looked at me down that table for a long moment, and then, I want to be exact, because I have heard this scene told wrong in this town for 40 years. She did not weep, and she did not rage. She put her 2 hands flat on the table and pushed herself up onto her feet at 71 and said to her son, "Do what she wants, Hollis. She has learned it properly, and I have nobody to blame." Then she walked the length of that room and out the door, and the clerk got up and opened it for her, and she went down the outside stair by herself, and she did not come to Lorena's wedding. And she died the following October, and she left the house to me in a will made in 1891 that nobody expected, with one line of explanation in it. To my son's wife Cordelia, who was the only one of us who ever paid for anything. It was done in that room in 50 minutes. Hollis signed a declaration before a notary fetched from across the street that he was married to Iva Prue by declaration in June of 1868, that she was his lawful wife until her death, that Nelson Prue was his lawful son and known to him as such, and Lucian Pruitt read it aloud twice, once for the board and once for the record, and it was entered in the minutes of the Corliss Falls and Southern Railroad, which is a book that will exist as long as there is a state of New York. It also went that afternoon into the county records office in a proceeding Pruitt had drawn in October and held ready, a petition reciting the fraud, my good faith, and the birth of my 3 children, praying that their legitimacy be declared. It was granted the following March by a judge in Syracuse who had sat under my father, and it was not contested, because the only person with an interest in contesting it had signed the declaration in the boardroom, and could not afterwards stand up and call himself a liar. Nelson Prue signed his release. The board voted the sale 6-0, $92 a share. And on the way out of that room, the banksman from Syracuse, a stranger to me, who had said perhaps 40 words all afternoon, stopped and said, "Mrs. Merriwether, you might have broken that sale altogether. There was 10 minutes when I thought you meant to." "I did mean to," I said. "But there are 38 families in this valley with money in this road, and I had 29 of their votes in my hand, and none of them did anything to me." Now let me finish it out, because the reckoning is not the end. Lorena was married on the 2nd of December, 1889, in the Presbyterian Church, 140 at the breakfast. There was talk. There was a great deal of talk, and it went on for 2 years, and I lost the chairmanship of the Ladies' Committee at the home in the spring, which was proposed by Mrs. Tenbrook with tears in her eyes, and passed unanimously. I stood up and thanked them, and walked home, and did not stop being a subscriber. And in 1892, they asked me back, and I said no. Hollis got his money, a little over $30,000 after the bank was paid. He settled a third of it on Nelson, as he had said he would. I will not pretend he did not, and it was more than the agreement required. He stayed in the house until March. Then one morning, he came down with 2 trunks and said that he was going to the city, and that he did not think he could go on living in a house where he was addressed correctly. And I said I thought that was probably true. He lived in New York 11 years and died there in 1900, and I went down for the funeral and stood at the head of the grave with my son on one side of me and his son on the other. We are not divorced because there was never anything to divorce. I have been Mrs. Cordelia Merriwether of Ridge Street for 40 years, and I have never once had to explain to a clerk what that means. And Ora was right about one thing at least. A name is worth a great deal, and the difference between us is that I found out what mine cost. Ansel took his father's place on the board of the successor company at 24 and is a serious, dry, careful man of 55 today, and he audits everything, and his wife complains of it. Minta is 39, the age I was in that January, and lives in Rochester, and she has 3 girls, and I have told all 3 of them this story, and their mother thinks I ought not to have. Nelson Prue is a partner in a machine works at Utica, and he has 5 children, and the eldest is named for his mother. We write 4 times a year. He came at Christmas for 18 years and stopped when his health went. His son sat at my table last month. And Iva Prue has a stone. That was the second thing on my list of 6, and it was the first one I got. It went up in the spring of 1890 at the back of the Corliss Falls Cemetery, in the Holmes strip where there had only been numbered iron markers. And it is granite, and it says her name and the years, and under that, at her son's asking, and against the advice of every soul who was consulted, wife and mother. Recorded at Utica, the 20th of June, 1868. The trustees objected to that last line. I paid for the stone, and I told them they might have the objection in writing, and I would frame it. Here is the last of it. I have the letter still. It is in this room, in a frame, over the desk, which people find morbid, and which I have long since stopped explaining. It is the letter Nelson Prue carried up my steps in the thaw, my own dear wife, and the 4 lines about the lame horse, and the promise to say it out loud in his own house by summer, and the date at the top in a different ink and a finer pen, put there in 1884 by a lawyer at an old woman's direction to turn a marriage into an affair. For a long time, I thought the point of that letter was the lie in it. I have come to think the point of it is the truth in it. Hollis Merriwether meant every word he wrote in June of 1870. He meant it for about 4 months. He was a man who meant well, right up until the moment when meaning well cost him something. And then he was arranged by somebody abler into a shape that fit. And once, when he was 25 and had a chance to be somebody, he let a woman with a valise and $100 go to Utica in his place. That is the whole family disease, and it did not stop with him. And I have watched for it in my own children all their lives. Minta asked me once, when she was grown, why I keep it on the wall. I told her the truth. It hangs there because it is the only object in this house that was not chosen for me. The dresses were chosen, and the settlement was drawn before I read it, and the pew was bought in 1862, and the very committee that made me feel useful was handed to me in 81, so that my signature would be under a dead girl's pension. In 19 years, the only thing that came into my hands unarranged was a stranger's envelope with a lavender smell on a wet afternoon, held out by a young man who told me plainly he would rather I never saw it. I could have shut that door. I have never once wished I had. Well, friends, that is where this one leaves us. And I have a question for you tonight. Cordelia refused to marry Hollis again, quietly, in December. She chose the record over the ceremony, and it cost her the last shred of her old life. Do you think she was right? Or would you have taken the quiet second wedding and let the rest of it lie? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every one. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. There should be a playlist coming up on your screen with more stories from this channel, and I would love for you to stay a while longer.